And in Newport News, Virginia, a little girl was born to Mary Bear and Louis Katz. Her name was Eva Marion Katz, and she joined her two older siblings, Mo and Molly. A few years later, her baby sister Ruth, or Rivel, joined the family, which eventually moved to Washington, D.C., where Louis Katz set up a shoe repair business. At just about the same period in Europe, equally momentous things were happening. In the Transylvanian town of Kolozsvár, now part of Romania, Sándor, or Alex, the youngest child of Emma Levy and Herman Eckstein, joined his 6 older brothers and sisters, Albert, Louis, Lillian, Irene, Ernest, and Saul. 10 years separated the oldest and youngest child. Alex was only 7 years old when, in March of 1926, Herman was able to send enough money from America to bring over his family. They settled in Pittsburgh, eventually residing at 6315 Phillips Avenue in Squirrel Hill, across from the Polizetic Synagogue. It was the Roaring Twenties. Herbert Hoover was president. D.H. Lawrence wrote Lady Chatterley's Lover. Walt Disney released his first Mickey Mouse films, and Amelia Earhart became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic. The family, especially the younger children, adapted quickly to life in America. Here we see, all lined up in a row, top to bottom, Ernie, Irene, and Alex. Even though 10 years separated Alex from his oldest brother, Albert, they shared a close relationship. Years passed and the family matured. Here we see a much older Alex with his parents, his brother Louis, and his lovely wife Esther, and their new baby daughter Carol, Lillian and her husband, Lou Smith, and a sister Irene. Now we move forward to 1936. People were struggling to make ends meet during the Great Depression. King George V of England died and was succeeded by his son Edward VIII. Elections in Germany gave Adolf Hitler 99% of the vote. Margaret Mitchell won the Pulitzer Prize for her novel Gone with the Wind. Frank Capra directed Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, and people were singing, "It's the Lovely." And in Atlantic City, New Jersey, one Miss Eva M. Katz was seen in the embraces of an unidentified young man, while a smiling young Ernie Eckstein, that's right, Ernie Eckstein, brother of Alex Eckstein, is the guy on the bottom.
Fast forward to the summer of 1941. Franklin Roosevelt was in his 3rd term as president. World War II was raging in Europe. The Germans were bombing London and had advanced to the outskirts of Leningrad and Moscow. They took Kiev, Odessa, and other major cities. Edward Hopper painted Nighthawks. Citizen Kane was playing at the movies, and people were singing Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered. Lovely Eva had graduated high school and was working for the Department of the Interior. Alex was attending Carnegie Tech in Pittsburgh, where he was studying metallurgy and had joined ROTC, the Reserve Officer Training Corps. As part of his ROTC training, Alex went to Fort Belvoir, outside of Washington. One night during the summer of 1941, Eva's friend Marion went to a USO dance and met a young man who later asked her out. This young man had a friend, Alex, from Pittsburgh. So Marion set up a double date with her friend Eva. Marion's date turned out to be a dud, but Eva and Alex hit it off right away. Unfortunately, by the end of July, Alex had to return to Pittsburgh when his training session ended. In his first letter to Eva, postmarked July 30th, 1941, he wrote, "So, it's back again to Pittsburgh for me in the same old dull life. No more of the excitements and thrills of camp, but best of all, no more of the getting up at the ungodly hour of 5:30. And yet I'm sorry it's all over, because it also means no more dates in Washington with you. It seems quite trite to say I've never enjoyed myself as much as I did on those last few dates with you, but it expresses the facts as best as could be done in a letter, so I'll leave it at that." Eva, somewhat more circumspect, responded, "I'm going to be selfish now and say that I wish your stay at Fort Belvoir had been extended. Our period of friendship was much too short. It would be nice if you could get back here before the next training period. Alex graduated from Carnegie Tech on April 26, 1942 as a second lieutenant and was posted briefly back at Fort Belvoir. From there, he went to Camp Edwards, Massachusetts for further training. He wasn't happy with his assignment, though. One day, he came across a notice on the bulletin board. The Army was looking for someone with an engineering background to serve in an ordnance unit. Alex applied and was accepted. He was then transferred to an ordnance depot in Maryland, and from there received orders to report to the Pentagon in Washington for an overseas assignment. He was to spend 6 to 7 weeks getting a passport and equipping himself for his new assignment. It was now the end of July, 1942.
During this period in Washington, Alex and his roommates stayed at the National Hotel in Washington. Since the Army was only paying them $7 per diem, and the hotel cost $3 a day, these two enterprising GIs decided to look for a rooming house so they could save some money. They found a nice place on 16th Street, which, as it turned out, was near Otis Place, where Eva and her family lived. During this period, Alex and Eva got to see a lot of each other. Their relationship blossomed. Alex finally got his orders at the end of September 1942. He was to report to New York and board a ship bound for the Middle East. He served in Eritrea, Palestine, and in Egypt. Later in the war, he served in Europe. Here he is in July of 1944 getting his fill of camping before leaving for France. As mentioned earlier, Alex was an ordnance officer. As such, he had the responsibility of seeing to it that the jeeps, tanks, and other Army vehicles were in good working order. Hopefully, the vehicles in his care were in better shape than this wreck. December 1945. The war ended in Europe on May 8th, and in the Pacific on August 14th, Alex's birthday. Evelyn Waugh wrote Brideshead Revisited. Frank Lloyd Wright completed the design for the Guggenheim Museum in New York. The Nobel Prize for Medicine went to Fleming, Florey, and Chain for the discovery of penicillin. And the Boxer of the Year was Rocky Graziano. And after 3 years devoted to the service of his country, Alex was released from the Army. Alex wasted no time in contacting Eva. They had corresponded all through the war, and I have the boxes of letters to prove it. They met several times in Washington. And in March of 1946 in Harrisburg, Alex proposed to Eva. The time between meetings passed slowly, but the letters flew back and forth between Washington and Pittsburgh as Alex continued his studies in metallurgy until getting a job in June of 1946 with the Continental Foundry and Machinery Company of Wheeling, West Virginia. Finally, the big day. On August 27, 1946, Eva and Alex were married at Beth Shalom Congregation in Washington, D.C. The happy couple honeymooned at the Hotel Marcy in Lake Placid, New York. They did some canoeing, relaxed by the pool, played some golf, hiked in the famed Ausable Chasm, saw Dick Button in an ice show, and had the chance to rest before starting a new life together in Wheeling.
Once back in Wheeling, they made friends quickly. The couple on the left are Sylvia and Paul Sepovitz, who after 50 years remain two of Eva and Alex's closest friends. The couple on the left later split up. I attribute this to the fact that, number one, he was the only guy who didn't buy his date flowers. Number two, the party hats were unforgivable. And number three, so was his tie. 1949. President Harry Truman was inaugurated president. George Orwell wrote 1984. People were singing Bali High in Some Enchanted Evening, and the New York Yankees defeated the Brooklyn Dodgers 4-1 to win the World Series. And a new little Eckstein entered the scene. Barbara Jean Eckstein was born January 17, 1949. This momentous event was soon followed by the arrival of Barry Lee Eckstein on October 10, 1950. Hey, Mom and Dad, What was with all those B names? Here I am, a 7-month-old, and I can't decide which I like better, the blanket or the bear. Oops, Barbara decides for me. Barbara and I got bigger and bigger. Here we are doing our Groucho Marx imitations. The family moved from Alexandria, Virginia to East Paterson, New Jersey, and eventually settled in Fairlawn, New Jersey. Alex worked at the Curtis Wright Corporation and later took a second job at the Bamberger's department store selling furniture. Eva was a homemaker, sisterhood and PTA member, Cub and Girl Scout leader extraordinaire, and later went to work in the billing department of Fisher Brothers Steel Corporation. Some of the best memories Barbara and I have of growing up were when we visited our many cousins. Here's a picture of me doing my poolside imitation of Frank Sinatra, surrounded by a bevy of screaming fans. We would just pile into the old black Dodge and trundle off to Pittsburgh through 7 tunnels on the way, or Pittsburgh, or Philadelphia, or that scenic city on the Susquehanna, Harrisburg. Of course, anyone who ever visited the Ecksteins in the summer will remember Lake Rickabear, the Curtis Wright Company lake in northwest New Jersey. In this 1957 snapshot, Barbara and I mug for the camera. Here Mom takes a 5-minute break with the New York Times before getting ready for another round of the favorite Lake Rickabear pastime, eating. Of course, there were other things to do: swimming, sunning, and if you were lucky, fishing.
From the late 1950s to the early 1960s, the Ecksteins, the Katzes, and the Sepovitzes spent part of the summer at the Marty Lee Apartments in Beach Haven, New Jersey. Oh, those waves! Oh, that sun! Oh, that corn! And oh, that crab imperial! The 4 Katz cousins were closest in age to the Eckstein kids, so you can just imagine the mayhem when we got together. Check out Barry and Lewis, the perpetual motion machines. No wonder the caption on the back of this snapshot reads, Aunt Eva after a visit from the Katzes. Mom, you can thank Judy for this one. We now move to the early 60s. JFK was elected, and 3 years later was assassinated. The Cold War heated up. Harper Lee wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel To Kill a Mockingbird. Teen culture was coming into its own. People were singing, Itsy bitsy teeny weeny yellow polka dot bikini, and Alfred Hitchcock directed Psycho. For the Ecksteins, there were some sad times. Here were the Eckstein brothers and sisters at their father's funeral in 1963. This was the last picture we have of all 7 siblings. It was around this time that we lost Saul Eckstein and our dear Bessie Katz. But mostly, they were happy times. Barry's bar mitzvah in October of 1963, new cars, celebrations, simchas. We think this is Stevie's wedding. Do you believe those hemlines? And quiet times for a moment of quiet reflection. It was a time to be with friends and nearby relations. The late 1960s and the early 1970s were a time of upheaval and protest in our country. The civil rights movement was energized by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and by Malcolm X. There was dissension and debate over Vietnam. It was a time of folk songs and rock songs, of Pete Seeger and the Beatles, of long hair and bell-bottoms. For the Ecksteins, it was a time of working hard to get 2 kids through college and worrying just a little about whether they would meet someone and settle down. Never fear, 1974 saw a new addition to the family as Barbara met and married a fellow Rutgers grad student, a handsome Annapolitan named Larry Greil, on August 11, 1974. The Katz family and the Eckstein family joined the Greil, Walpert, and Gorelnik families for a most perfect weekend made even more so by the recent resignation of Richard Nixon 3 days earlier.
In June of the next year, another Simcha. Barry met former Fairlawn High School classmate Sandy Dell in the Sam Goodies at Garden State Plaza, and it was love at first listen. Here are the newly minted Mr. and Mrs. Barry Eckstein stepping out for the first time. And here are Eva and Alex and Bea and Herb Dell, Sandy's parents, celebrating the fact that at last they have married off their youngest children, some peace and quiet, at last. But I'm sure Eva and Alex would agree that in Sandy and Larry they could not have found a better daughter and son-in-law. So the family was growing by leaps and bounds, or whoops and hounds. Here are Eva and Alex, Irene and Irv, myself and Sandy, Barbara and Larry, and Marcia and Lily, gathered together to celebrate Eva and Alex's 30th anniversary in August of 1976. As the 1970s came to a close, Eva and Alex and all of us had even more to celebrate. The arrival in November 1979 of Miss Laura Hope Eckstein. Here are the proud parents and the proud grandpa. I think the expression on Alex's face pretty much speaks for itself. The 1980s, from a political perspective, many of us Ecksteins and Katzes had little to cheer about. Suffering as they did through a decade of Reagan-Bush speeches and policies. But there were at least two bright spots in that bleak horizon. The arrival in May of 1982 of none other than Rachel Ann Eckstein, and a little later of the bar mitzvah boy himself,
Robert Isaac Ryle, who was born on August 24th, 1983, and who we picked up on August 27th, 1983, which happened to be Eva and Alex's 37th anniversary. The late 1980s and the early 1990s saw some incredible changes in the world landscape. The Berlin Wall fell, and Germany was reunited. The Soviet Union disbanded, and sweeping social and economic changes began. Apartheid ended in South Africa, and Nelson Mandela became that country's first black president. In the Middle East, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and President Bush sent U.S. troops to fight. And amidst all this confusion, a beautiful little baby girl was born in Louisville, Kentucky on February 28, 1991, the day the Gulf War ended, and coincidentally, the first day of Purim. That little girl was our own Madeline Esther Gryle. Eva and Alex have so enjoyed their grandchildren. The late 1990s were a time of change for Eva and Alex as well. They just got fed up with this, and decided in 1990 to trade all that in for this. And, as Martha Stewart would say, it was a good thing. Though they loved being near their grandchildren, watching them grow and grow and grow, I think Eva and Alex would be the first to tell you that these last 7 years have been some of the happiest they have shared. Even with health problems and the loss of dear friends and relatives, for them, the glass is always half full, not half empty. Through the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and on into the 90s, they have taught us all something about compromise and getting along, about caring for people rather than things, and about the importance of education, intellectual curiosity, and hard work. Thanks to their example, we make Judaism a central part of our lives. On this wonderful double simcha, we wish you mazel tov and say l'chaim, to life. Here's to many more happy and healthy years together.
We love you.